Thank you for downloading this podcast from the Forum for Philosophy. Subscribe for weekly discussions of science, culture, politics, and the arts from a philosophical perspective. The Forum is a non-profit organisation, and our events are free and open to all. You can support our work via our website and Facebook page.
I'm Shahidha. Lots of you know me from coming to Forum events, and this is our Valentine's Week special. Are there any happy couples in the audience? Who knows? We'll find out. Unhappy couples too. Divorce proceed, all the rest. Thank you for joining us. We are. I hope that you're prepared for quite a rigorous philosophy session. We're going to be closely examining the logic of Love Actually. If you know that film, Men Like Me, I'm sure there are things that keep you up at night, like how on earth did Chris Marshall pull 3 beautiful blondes in Wisconsin? And how dare Alan Rickman make Emma Thompson cry? Right. We are going to be talking about rom-coms in general, and specifically screwball comedies, as a nod to the film philosopher Stanley Cavell, who died in June 2018. We'll be asking, why do rom-coms have this enduring appeal, and can this genre teach us anything about the ethics of relationships? So we'll find out. Our speakers are Professor Sarah Churchwell. She holds a chair in Public Understanding of the Humanities and is a Professorial Fellow in American Literature at the School of Advanced Studies at the University of London. Advanced study it is, isn't it? And the journalist, writer and broadcaster, Robert Hanks. He writes about radio, television, theatre, books, bicycles. That's another one.
Yeah, not for a while.
That's okay. Bicycles is another form of event. And film. And he writes and edits for Sight and Sound, amongst many other publications. And Dr. Catherine Wheatley is a senior lecturer in film studies at King's College London, and she's published an extremely expensive book on Cavell, but it's well worth it, apparently. Hanukkah and Anglo-French cinema. And so I think the French angle makes you our Claudette Colbert tonight. Sarah has to be Catherine Hepburn.
Thank you very much.
And Robert, you can be Cary Grant or the leopard in Bringing Up Baby. So we had to do great homework for this event, watching amazing films. And I ended up watching It Happened One Night. And I was doing some looking up the Wikipedia entry, and Claudette Colbert apparently said after rapping that she told a friend, "I just finished the worst picture in the world." But in 1934 it won Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Actress, and Best Writing, right? So it evidently wasn't. And that actually does happen to be my rom-com of choice. It's a close run thing between that and Clueless. But it might be It Happened One Night. So what about you guys? For Valentine's Day, what's your rom-com of choice? Sarah, why don't you kick us off?
Well, you've stolen my thunder, because it would have actually been It Happened One Night. But I was also, partly because that was the one that brought me into screwball as well. But I do think it epitomizes the genre and is kind of almost a perfect film. I was going to break the rules by naming like all kinds of favorite films. I do have and you mentioned Katharine Hepburn. I do have an incredible soft spot for The Philadelphia Story. Although I would actually argue the toss about whether it's a screwball, because it's actually a Taming of the Shrew story, and that's a problem for me as a feminist. So I have to kind of go around that one.
Yeah.
So then I'm going to come in with His Girl Friday.
Great. And why?
Because Rosalind Russell and Cary Grant are so perfectly matched, because it's so deeply cynical, because it's the fastest talking film of all time, apparently still, and because that's how I learned to talk. And so when when I'm among my screwball people, I have permission to talk like Rosalind Russell, and it's great relief.
Yeah, amazing. We're going to get a lot into this. What about you, Robert?
I think I'd plump for The Awful Truth. And actually it's a similar thing, that it's Cary Grant and this time with Irene Dunne, and I think they're matched in a very different way, but there's a sense of them both having the same kind, it's not as fast, but it's got the same wit and the sort of emotional intelligence about it, and also a really funny dog. That's,
I don't know. Really funny dog. Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
so
Skippy, in fact, was the name of Skippy, who was Astor in the Thin Man films, and Mr. Smith in The Awful Truth, and he's George in Bringing Up Baby. So this is the greatest film acting dog of all time.
He is, absolutely.
Any Oscars for Best Dog?
No.
We need to work on that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Kathy, what about you?
I think that I would go, and funny enough, I was just saying I don't like The Philadelphia Story that much for quite a few reasons, but when I was growing up, it was definitely my favourite because I was greedy, and you get 2 romances for the price of one.
Yeah.
And Cary Grant and James Stewart.
Yeah.
And Catherine Hepburn.
Yes.
So,
And Ruth Huxley, let's not leave her out.
Yeah, she's amazing.
She's
She's
fantastic.
amazing in it.
Yeah.
Yeah. She's so droll in that.
Yeah,
isn't
exactly.
she? Yeah.
I think I'm sweet. It's one of the great all-time lines. I use it often.
Feel free to quote us, by the way, when we throw out these lines. Let's start our conversation. I was going to ask you, Catherine, to kick us off, because you're our philosopher, and I wondered if you could place us in the philosophical context of screwball comedy, because I wonder what you think Cavell sees in that form, and whether you think that we should be looking to this form for some sort of philosophical understanding.
And I was just about to say I don't feel like a philosopher, but then Cavell would say that everyone is a philosopher, and the philosophy of the ordinary is the most important kind of the philosophy. And I actually wanted to start, if I may, by reading a short passage from Cavell's essay, The Thought of Movies, which is in a collection called Cavell on Film, edited by William Rothman. And he writes in that, "I understand it to be, let me say, a natural vision of film that every motion and station, in particular every human posture and gesture, however glancing, has its poetry, or you may say its lucidity. Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton live on this knowledge, and perhaps bring it to its purest expression. The Hollywood talkie finds an equivalent for this expressiveness in the way certain pairs of human beings are in conversation. Any of the arts will be drawn to this knowledge, this perception of the poetry of the ordinary. But film, I would like to say, democratizes the knowledge." And I chose this passage because it emphasizes the 2 most important things for Cavell, I think, about screwball comedy and its relationship to philosophy. The first of which is its relationship to the ordinary. And Cavell sees the ordinary and film as being a very privileged relationship anyway, far more so than any of the other arts. But I'm not really talking about the ordinary in the sense that social realism would be talking about the ordinary, but about the fact that these films turn around not war heroes or princes and princesses, but a man and a woman going about the very everyday business of falling in love and staying in love, with some bumps along the way. But secondly, that the way in which those couples come together is through conversation, and the film's dialogue, and that very witty, sort of rapid-fire dialogue that Sarah was just mentioning. And I say together, or come together, but in fact what these couples are doing in the films that Cavell is particularly interested in is coming back together. He writes about a subgenre of the screwball, which he calls the remarriage comedy in his book Pursuits of Happiness. And he's interested in particular in films in which the central pair start off either being together or having been together, and then they part ways, there's a dispute, something happens, and over the course of the film, they find their way back together again. He puts it really nicely when he writes, "In classical comedy, people made for one another find one another. In remarriage comedy, people who have found one another find that they are made for one another." And he sees those quick-fire, witty conversations that these people engage in as ordinary words, daily conversation, but also a kind of what he calls philosophical dispute. The men and women get together in these films by bearing up under an assault of words. I think that's a lovely turn of phrase. Yeah. Giving as good as they get. They're able to laugh together. They laugh with each other and at one another and at themselves, which is really important for Cavell. But they also argue together in really fabulous and funny ways. In a way, kind of the argument is what's so funny about the films. And my husband is here today. Yeah. And I sort of love this line from Cavell where he says, "The best marriages are the ones in which the couples bicker the most." Yeah.
I would say I'm winning.
But it's true that he sees bickering as a kind of form of care. That if you care about someone, you care enough to kind of try and get them to see things from your point of view. And in these films, actually, when couples have that sort of finishing each other's sentences, true love, everything agrees, it's often when they feature Ralph Bellamy, and it's all wrong. And he's fully in love with the leading lady of the film, and it's because he doesn't understand her, he doesn't understand what she wants, either because she's trying to pull the wool over his eyes, or because he just can't see clearly who that person is. So the Ralph Bellamy way of being in love is not a good one in these films, nor is it for Cavell. But nor is divorce itself. Divorce is kind of the worst possible outcome, because that's just turning your back on someone and giving up on the argument and saying, I don't care about you enough to continue bickering. And what he sees as the kind of the good outcome, the happy outcome for these films, is the couple recommitting to continue arguing, in a sense, to live another day. And so these aren't films in which we get a happy ending where they culminate in a beautiful white wedding, with some exceptions. They're not films of marriage, but of remarriage. They're about couples being able to wake up every morning and start again and be married again, and so on and so forth. It's a willingness for repetition. And the reason that Cavell sees this as very philosophically important is because he sees that kind of domestic, ordinary life that's epitomised by marriage is tantamount or kind of analogous with our ability to just commit to being in the ordinary world. And alongside a lot of other contemporary philosophers, he believes that we find ourselves in modern life in a position where we're being overcome by what he calls a skeptical crisis. We're feeling adrift, we lack the kind of reassurances of religion or humanism. In short, we can't really, there's no anchor point to the world anymore. We never know if somebody else sees the world in the same way that we do. And there are three possibilities that we can do in that case. The first is that we kind of throw our hands up, throw in the towel and say, I can't go on any longer, I'll never know anything. The second is that we say, through human endeavour, I will know something, I will be sure of something. And that is kind of futile as giving up. And the third is to say that we replace knowledge with acknowledgement. So we say we can't be sure, we'll never know. I never know what Sarah means or what Shahidha means or what Robert means. But what I can do is acknowledge what it is that they're trying to tell me, just as Cary Grant can try and acknowledge what Katharine Hepburn is trying to say to him. So Screwball is important to Cavell because it shows us how to disagree well and to listen well. And I think that's really important for me personally, and some of the stuff that I've been thinking about recently in terms of the current political climate. And I noticed the other week when Joaquin Phoenix gave that BAFTA speech, the very controversial one about institutional racism, how often he used the phrase acknowledgement. And to take a contemporary example, we will have all had that experience with the Brexit hoo-ha, where we've either wanted to retreat to our own communities of kind of like-minded people and only hear what we think, and then we're shocked when people disagree. And that's the Ralph Bellamy kind of approach to going about Brexit. Or we've decided that we just don't want anything to do with it anymore, and we want to sort of obliterate anyone that disagrees with us and ban them from our Facebook feed and our Twitter feed. And that's the divorce approach to dealing with it. And what Cavell would ask of us and what Screwball models for us is that we should, in fact, have enough faith in other people to hope that we might be able to persuade them, that they might have enough respect for them, that maybe they will come around to our way of thinking, but that we can only do that by opening ourselves up enough to the possibility that they might be able to persuade us. And I think that opens then not only onto philosophy and why philosophy is so interested in these films, but politics as well, which might be something we can come back to in due course.
Brilliant, thank you. I've got so many things to ask you, but one of the things I was thinking about was how entirely right you are that and Sarah is in the discourse, the mode of discourse, the speed, the alacrity with which they respond, and the way that they listen so that they can respond with wit and understanding is a great part of the charm of these films. But I wonder if that kind of the rapier wit and the sniping and the fencing and the darting and all of that is happening linguistically. But I wonder, actually I was thinking about the end of Philadelphia Story, spoiler alert, when that moment when Katharine Hepburn, when Jimmy Stewart leaps in and says, I'll marry you, and then she looks and she says, I don't think, Liz would like that. She says, I don't think Liz would like that, because she's been listening throughout the film where Jimmy Stewart hasn't. And you see Cary Grant also balking, and there's a kind of register that they're all listening to each other in different ways. But I wondered if so the relationship is happening through the language and the delivery of it. But I wonder if that is a substitute for bodies, for sex, right? Is you're flirting through language and you're building relationships through language, but is what's not spoken sex? Like in a modern rom-com, they would rip each other's clothes off, right? Is there a kind of a coyishness, a coquettishness
I think
there?
it's really striking, certainly in how Cavell writes about these films, how chaste they are. And he talks about the fact that often in these films, the couples kind of become brother and sister. They play games. We see it throughout Bringing Up Baby, as well as in the Philadelphia story, that they kind of play at being mother and father or brother and sister. They play hide and seek. So there's something that's kind of strangely innocent and naive about these couples, and I think about the ending of Bringing Up Baby, actually, when Katharine Hepburn kisses Cary Grant at the top of that pillar.
Yeah,
and there's something
this
really
confidence.
unsexy, actually, about that kiss.
But they're a bit inept, both of them.
Yes.
at it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's almost as if they're kind of learning to be...
I think they're children who are discovering
Yeah.
love and discovering sex.
But it's also part of it being a remarriage. It's not that initial kind of thunderbolt lust where we want to tear
they're
our
not
clothes
getting
off.
remarried,
It's-
right? I mean,
Yeah.
can I?
Yeah, of course.
Because we had sort of roughly agreed some kind of topics that each of us would cover, and this actually does swing into.
Go for it.
If that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
Rather than kind of try to get back around to
Yeah.
it, because it is directly related to it. So, because I think that the fact that screwball comedy is, as Andrew Sarris famously called it, sex comedies without the sex, is actually crucial to it. And it is part of the way that the language works there, as you're suggesting, is that it is a comedy of sublimation. It's a comedy of repression, and what happens is all of that energy comes out verbally, right? So it absolutely is sublimated, and that comes out as anger and as bickering and as sexual tension.
Yeah.
And the sexual tension plays out through. So it's a comedy of courtship. It's a comedy of, as you say, it's kind of dancing with language. It's kind of fencing with language. It's dueling. It's demonstrating that they're equals, that they're equal combatants in the battle of the sexes. And it is a battle of the sexes, but it's a battle of the sexes in which they win by having sex. Right? And they both win, because by the end they're going to go off and have sex, and that's what's going to happen. So it becomes this long deferred, it's all foreplay. The whole comedy is foreplay. And that happened actually because of a series of historical accidents that are really important to understanding screwball. When we talk about screwball, and you say it's about bickering, I always want to bicker with Cavell about this, because there are a lot of things I want to take him up on about this.
He would appreciate
I know he would. I know he would.
And then you would get remarried.
Well, yeah, we'd have to have been married in the first place, which is one of the things I want to take him up on, is there are a great number of screwballs in which they are not about remarriage, Bringing Up Baby being just one of many, in which they get married at the end. He's engaged to somebody else throughout the...
Miss Swallow.
Miss Swallow. They're well-named Miss Swallow. And Bringing Up Baby is a really good example of this aspect of sublimation that I want to talk about. But the thing about the bickering, and so I'll work my way back around to this, is that the ways in which they worked is that there was, as many of you will know, there was a rule passed. It was actually implemented for the first time in 1934 called the Hays Code, right? And the Hays Code was brought into force, and that was the Hollywood censorship code. It was actually written a few years earlier, but it was ignored. And then what happened was they made a series of increasingly sexy movies, most famously a Jean Harlow movie called Red-Headed Woman and a Barbara Stanwyck movie called Babyface, in which these women were clearly having sex out of wedlock, and they were sleeping their way to the top and then winning, and it was all a happy ending, and this was just absolutely horrifying. And these two movies had this big backlash. Particularly the Catholic League of Decency was horrified that immorality was getting rewarded. And so Hollywood was faced with a choice. It could either self-censor, or it could face boycotts and all kinds of, kind of moral outcry. And so, being Hollywood in the studio system, they took the easy out, and they decided that they would self-censor. And that was when the famous kind of infantilization of Hollywood films began, and it lasts from 1934, when the Hays Code was implemented, until the mid-1960s, when you have the breakdown of all of those censorship codes in literature as well as in film, right? So you have the famous Lady Chatterley's Lover trial, you have Ulysses. So censorship starts to break down socially on the Anglo, and we're talking here about the Anglo-American scene, obviously. So censorship there breaks down, and that happens in Hollywood a few years later. So by the late 60s, it's kind of all fallen apart. And then you get the modern method of screen guidance, right, of PG and PG-13 and all of those using the American ones. But then you've got this 30-year period in which the characters become children, partly because of the rules of the game, that they can't talk about sex, they can't acknowledge sex, they can't swear, there are all kinds of rules, right? It becomes this very rule-bound form. But a couple of other things happen in 1934 in America that make screwball just explode into existence. We've already mentioned the importance of sound. We need to remember that sound cinema is a new thing at this point. It's really only getting perfected in the early 1930s. 28, 29 is when it comes in. It takes a couple of years for them to get the kinks out, literally and figuratively. And then by about 30 and 31, they're starting to really push it. We also need to remember that 1930 and 1931 in the United States are the absolute depths of the Great Depression. Absolute depths. And the movies that come out, like Red-Headed Woman and Babyface, are grim, cynical, nasty movies. They're fabulous. I highly recommend them. But it is America at its grittiest. And of course, this is where the gangster movies start to really get a hold as well. The great early gangster movies with George Raft, Jimmy Cagney, 31, 32, 33, Public Enemy, those kinds of movies, right? So all of that is happening. You're getting this kind of urban, filth that is, again, in kind of every sense from the perspective of the Catholic League of Decency, is permeating its way into these movies. And then what happens? FDR gets elected. And FDR gets elected and the New Deal comes in. And all of a sudden there's an economic turnaround, which begins very quickly. People are being put back to work. And suddenly the country enters this new mode of optimism. And then I think actually the most important proximate cause, 1933, everybody always forgets this. It's so important. Prohibition is repealed. Oh. Everybody gets drunk. Yeah. Everybody just gets absolutely loaded. And so what happens in these movies? Liberation. Yeah. Except they can't have sex. Yeah. So it's liberation about everything except that.
But you can tank a lot of champagne.
But you can get absolutely loaded and drive around the countryside. And so what the filmmakers do is they start to create all of these tropes and topoi that let them play. And it gets very playful, very quickly, and very deliberate. So they start making dirty jokes. So these guys, these are men of the world. And I say men advisedly. They're almost all men who are writing and directing these movies, Howard Hawks and people like that. And so they decide, all right, if we have to work within these absolutely idiotic rules, then we're going to have some fun with it, right? So Bringing Up Baby, as you say, what's Bringing Up Baby about? It's about a man who's trying to find his bone, and he's running around for the whole movie trying to find his bone, and at one point, he is asked, where does the bone go? And he says, the only thing I know is that it doesn't go in the tail, right? So, and I teach this movie sometimes to students, and they go, oh, but they didn't mean that. And I'm like, well, it wasn't an accident. Yeah. They didn't just slip and start making all of these post-Freudian double entendres, and of course, Freud is very big at the time as well. Mm-hmm. So what happens is that you get this language of code and it's very subversive, actually. Everything has to be encoded, but they start to play with that. So they start to see how much they can get away with. And so there's this meta level of the comedy where the writers and the directors and the actors are seeing how far they can push it, how much can they get past the censors, how naive are the censors, and how far can they take it. And then those energies infuse through the basic structure of the drawing room comedy. So they're also borrowing from Noel Coward. They're borrowing, obviously, from Shakespeare, which Cavell has a lot to say about these kinds of comedies of couples bickering, and that's the way that they establish their love. And then there's this, as I say, there's this kind of push of liberating energy, of breaking the rules. That's an upsurge of optimism. But in terms of the question about whether it's about remarriage and how we think about screwball, it begs questions about definition. How do we define what is a screwball? What are we actually talking about?
How do you do it?
Well, so the thing that I find interesting about this is that the screwball, unlike a lot of genres, including most famously film noir, everybody knows film noir didn't talk about itself as film noir. It was named by the French critics of the Cahiers du Cinéma in the 1960s retrospectively to talk about these interesting movies that Hollywood had made in the 40s. So it gets this retrospective label. But screwball is more like a Western in that people set out to make screwballs. Very quickly it acquired the name, and they were consciously setting out to make screwball comedies. And they start talking about them as screwy. And I think that what actually happens is that rhetorical energy that idea of screwiness starts to just, people are unconsciously and sometimes consciously playing with the ideas of screwiness. And I wanted to bring out a quotation that I really like. This is from the great American comic writer S.J. Perelman in 1940, so actually towards the end of the genre. So he says, particular to this century is a form of wit inadequately known as screwball. And it was inadequately known as that because it just picked that up in the newspapers. It just was this term that they started using to describe it, and then people started using it, and then it just kind of caught on and people kept using it. But it is an inadequate term for it. But it became the one that they started using. So they would say, I'm going to make a screwball comedy. And I think that that sense of self-consciousness is an important way of thinking about the way that they approach the genre. So he says, peculiar to this century is a form of wit inadequately known as screwball. Its method is free association. Its state of mind somewhere between a power dive and a tailspin. It has close affinity with hot jazz, surrealist painting, and the deranged poetry of Rimbaud. It calls for an exquisite sense of cliché and mimicry and a nihilism which delights in knocking over-crystallized words, objects, and gestures into glassy pieces that cut each other. Which I think is an absolutely brilliant description of screwball, just as it was coming to the end. And it was coming to the end because basically Preston Sturges takes it, runs with it, pushes it as far as it can go in 3 great final screwballs. And then in my view, it's not about defining screwball, but recognizing that it is a historically specific response to these sets of cultural conditions that I'm talking about. World War II brings it to an end, in my view. Then you have romantic comedy after that, but you don't have screwball. And you have people trying to make screwball, mimicking it. And particularly in the early 70s, a couple of, you get the Ryan O'Neal one for What's Up Pussycat, where they...
What's Up Doc?
What's Up Doc, sorry, What's Up Pussycat, it's a different one. Thank you. I was like, What's Up Tiger Lily? No, that's a different one too. So What's Up Doc, exactly, which is Bogdanovich, absolutely terrible, right? And it's because it's like it didn't understand what made screwball possible. And so, but I also think that you probably can't replicate that perfect storm of energies and cultural conditions, and of course, the very great actors who we've been alluding to, but are so central to it. You have these great performers who take this genre the same way that you've got great Western stars who take it and own it.
Well, let me put that to you. How far, when we think of screwball comedy, and we are going to get to Love Actually, trust me, I promise. But when we think of screwball comedy, we do think of those iconic couples. So how far do you think, Catherine and Robert, how far do you think it is tethered to the personnel involved, the star power?
Well, just listening to Sarah talking, there's Tamar Jeffers McDonald's written a book about romantic comedy, and one of the things she talks about in that, and I think Cavell mentions it as well, is the idea that it's so female-centric, and that we have, wonderful Cary Grant and great male leads, but also the women that make up these films. And one of the things that both Jeffers McDonald and Cavell point out is that this is kind of the daughters of the first wave of feminism and emancipation, and so there's a particular kind of female liberation that's being shown in these films. And in fact, I read something that said that screwy was first applied to Carole Lombard. So it starts as a term that's referring to the female heroines, and then comes to refer to the film. So it's almost like screwball is born out of these women. But I was related to that, and it's a question maybe for Sarah, I don't know if you know the answer to this, is I was wondering to what extent actually the possibility of divorce coming up around this historical moment, and marriages being made for love as opposed to arranged marriages or familial marriages affected the extent to which these characters. So that's slightly hijacking your question.
No.
But, can we? I think it probably feeds into this notion of these female actresses and where they were coming from and what they embody in terms of.
Can we park it and come back to that one? And I promise we will. But I wanted to let Robert come in because you've been quietly holding your peace,
there are just so many different bits and pieces I'd like to come back. Going back to the thing you say there about it's no longer about arranged marriage, it's marriage for love. One of the interesting things about the 30s screwballs is that they take place in environments with a lot of money around, and that actually money is never really an issue. And in ones where it might be, like it happened one night, where Clark Gable is actually a fairly impoverished reporter, he makes it very clear that his interest in Claudette Colbert has nothing to do with the fact that she's an heiress. He'll only accept $39.60 in expenses for trouble he's gone through looking after. He
and he'll throw in the socks for free.
Exactly. In fact, he's contemptuous of her money.
Yes, and that's really so that's a really important thing. That there are all people with money, and I actually think it feeds in to I think the two great genres that I like to think about in Anglo-American literature and film, one is the genre of the unprotected woman, which is Jane Eyre and some of the Jane Austens and things like that, where it's the woman who has no money and no profession because it wouldn't be respectable to have a profession. So how do you look after yourself? That's one of the genres. The other is the working class lad who really wants to screw rich girls. And that takes you all the way through to Kingsley Amis and all of those things. And it's a big thing in these. And there's some sense, and part of this is purely economic, that rich girls, if they get pregnant, well, they can afford to do something about it. But it's also, they're going to dress better and they're going to smell nicer and they're going to look, and all of the, this is what Katharine Hepburn exemplifies in Bringing Up Baby. And it's Claudette Colbert very definitely showing her legs off and things.
So where would you put the Lady Eve in then?
Well, that's a really interesting one, because she doesn't have money. She's very interested in money, except it has to be made clear that that's not the basis of her interest in him or his interest in her. They have to create this. So the Lady Eve, Barbara Stanwyck plays a con woman who meets Henry Fonda, who's the heir to a brewing empire, so she calls him Hopsy, on board a boat. And she sets out to take him for all his money, but then she realizes she's actually in love with him. Then he discovers she's a con woman, and he says, this whole thing was fake, and I have nothing to do with you. And she says, no, it's not fake. Yeah. And she's so angry with him that when he leaves her, she takes her revenge by then disguising herself as an aristocrat from Britain, the Lady Eve. And there's a cockamamie story about an illegitimate birth. That's why they look exactly the same. She's really not seen. So he falls in love with her all over again, this time believing she has money. And then she engineers it so that they marry, and he immediately divorces her when she tells him all the men she slept with. And then they meet again. Yeah, which is also fake. And then again they meet on board the boat, and this time she's herself again, the con woman. But this time, seeing her, he realizes that she's the only woman for him. And the last 5 minutes of the film are them kissing and struggling together towards the bedroom, the cabin she's in. And at the last minute he says, I can't go into your cabin, I'm married. And she says, so am I, because she's just married him. But he doesn't realise that's who he's married to. And this is one of the really interesting... And then it stops. Absolute best. And it's actually one of the interesting things about the remarriage comedy is that it is a strategy. If this couple is already married, it's okay for them to have sex. Yeah. So, so it's always there. They could be having sex in a way that if they're not, they can't be. I mean, Bringing Up Baby gets around that by making them children. They clearly don't know what sex is. They're clearly not going to do anything to
Go on, Sarah.
Yeah, well, I just would. So this question about the economic relationship of the characters in Screwball is one that gets talked about all the time. And again, it begs this question of what movies we're calling Screwball. I'm going with the movies that define themselves as Screwball in the period, that marketed themselves as Screwball. So I should say I became obsessed with these movies when I was about 13. And so when normal people were memorizing David Bowie lyrics, I was obsessively watching every Screwball comedy I could find, and hundreds of them. And so I've been really interested in this question of trying to map this kind of taxonomy of what actually they thought Screwball was, as opposed to what we say about it when we take 5 or 6 movies and hold them as a representative. And so often people say that what happens is that it is, in fact, crossing class lines, that a rich person and a poor person, like in It Happened One Night or The Lady Eve, and that what that's doing is then imagining an American reconciliation of rich and poor in this kind of American utopian ideal where everybody will kind of come together and class barriers will be overcome by love, right? So there's this kind of mythical American dream, almost a different take on it. But in fact, when it, Robert's already just played out some of the ways in which that doesn't really hold. It doesn't hold for a lot of them. So can I just read I just jotted down very quickly, and I can do it fast, as we've established. A couple of examples, and also this might give you a couple of movies to go watch if you want to learn more about Screwball. So, rich women can marry poor men, as in It Happened One Night, or Libeled Lady, or indeed Bringing Up Baby, or The Richest Girl in the World, or Joan Crawford's only Screwball, The Terrible Love on the Run. Don't watch that one. But of course, there are Screwballs in which rich men marry poor women. There are many Cinderella versions of Screwball. Easy Living, an early Preston Sturges, which is absolutely fantastic. Also one called Fifth Avenue. Sullivan's Travels is one of the obvious ones, Preston Sturgis again, the Lady Eve, bachelor mother, I met him in Paris. But the rich can also reject inferior suitors from inferior classes and stay together, which may be the really awful truth of the awful truth.
Yeah.
They're both rich and they stay together. And there are more than a few screwballs in which the poor reject the seductions of material wealth and stay together, as in Hands Across the Table or Midnight. Then there are films like Lady Eve and My Man Godfrey, in which a rich man or in this case, My Man Godfrey, a rich man pretends to be poor, so that the film can pretend that rich and poor are getting together, but in fact it's actually rich, and so it's actually rich and rich staying together.
That's not right. He is poor, but he recovers his fortune. He was previously rich. He's lost all his money and is now living out on the...
Yeah,
he's rejected his money.
He's rejected his money. He's rejected his money, and then he makes it back again.
Yeah.
But he has rejected his money.
He's
rich.
At the end of Philadelphia Story, which I watched very recently, there is everybody hates
George.
Poor George. Poor George. And remember, it begins with Katharine Hepburn leaping on George in his horse riding gear, and she rolls him in the mud because he's so nouveau, he's so ariste, he's not scrubby enough because he's not grown up in Philadelphia riding pedigree horses. Yeah. But at the end, he turns to them and says, so he says something like, it's the end of your class, you people are going to be coming down.
Exactly.
And actually, it struck me, that moment where the very rich aristocratic couple are going to sail off together on their lovely yacht, isn't that far from Four Weddings and a Funeral, right? Where the rich are going to hang out together. The landed aristocracy are going to hang out. So that's my question to you.
These films, to go back to your other question about, is it tethered to the stars? It is to some extent. These films are definitely about an aristocracy, and they would present themselves about being an aristocracy of the mind and of personal excellence. So you have really beautiful people like Katharine Hepburn and Cary Grant. And there's a wonderful line of Stanley Cavell's, which is something about Katharine Hepburn, where he says something about her physical assurance is the embodiment of her intelligence. Yeah. That the way she moves and the way she looks, you can tell she's smart. And you can tell that with Cary Grant as well. So these are excellent. They would say, we're higher class than Ralph Bellamy or the guy who plays George, because we're more agile, we're more graceful and beautiful
more
and clever,
refined.
and we're funnier.
They even get drunk well, don't they?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's about style.
But actually, it's because they have money that they can do this.
Yeah,
of course
absolutely.
it is.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But they try to reject it, right? So in the Philadelphia Story, the response to when he says your whole class is going down, they say, "Class my eye," and they have this running line where they try to get away from it by saying that Mac the Night Watchman is a prince among men and Uncle Millie is a pincher, right? Which is to your point about character, right? So they keep saying Mac the Night Watchman is a prince among men, but it's not a movie about Mac the Night Watchman, right?
The Philadelphia Story is interesting in that respect because you have James Stewart, who is playing a sort of lower class, but it's James Stewart, so we all know that he's in that kind of upper echelon of stardom. But Ruth Hussey is it's kind of more of a Ralph Bellamy type in many ways, and so it does seem to have its cake and eat it, but it is playing with class in a really complicated way.
Let me ask. I'm trying to edge out of our screwballs into dangerous rich. I know. I'm trying to edge into dangerous Richard Curtis territory. But this is what I want to ask you, Robert. How does our modern rom-com stack up next to this noble and eminent tradition of the screwball comedy?
Well, if we can go back a bit, one of the things I wanted to talk about, which you gestured at, was how you represent sex when you're not allowed to represent sex. And I think, if you're talking about rom-coms, you also need to, screwballs in the 30s, you also need to bring in things like Astaire and Rogers films, which are effectively screwball comedies. And also crime films like the Thin Man films.
Yeah.
And
both
what you
of
see
which
is...
come out in 1934, by the way. So, the original version.
My Man Godfrey.
So the Thin Man, My Man Godfrey is 36, but it happened one night. 36. It happened.
I bow to you on this.
Trust me on that one. It happened one night. The Gay Divorcee, 20th Century, and the Thin Man all come out in 1934 and are generally acknowledged as the birth of the screwball. Anyway, go ahead. You were saying.
But so there are various things you do. I mean, one of the things that you have in films is dancing, and in Top Hat you have Fred and Ginger doing Cheek to Cheek, which is like watching sex on film. It's extraordinary, and you see at the end of their dance together, when he's lifted her up and whirled her around the floor in this extraordinary feathered dress she has, she stops and she gasps and goes kind of, and it's almost like lighting up and saying, "How was it for you?" And it's really extraordinary.
And the backbends for dancers, those
Yes.
the lunges are incredible.
Yeah, and I mean, the thing that the cliche about the two is that he gave her class, she gave him sex. And you get that. You do get. I mean, going back to how women-centric they are again with the Lady Eve. Henry Fonda is the male character in that. he's just a prop. He hardly has anything to do in the film except occasionally do some pratfalls.
Yeah.
All the sex comes from Barbara Stanwyck. She
Yeah.
just generates this extraordinary electricity through the whole thing.
But what about our modern rom-com? Is
Well,
it still
what I was-
wise and
I was
educational?
going to move on to say, I do think one of the things about not being able to show sex is it does force you to think about it. And sorry, I was going to say that the obverse of the Fred and Gingers is Ralph Bellamy in The Awful Truth, who takes Irene Dunn
his
dancing,
girlfriend.
and he's terrible
Oh, yeah.
at it. And he clomps around that, he does this kind of yeehaw polka with her. And it's dreadful. And it's clear that they are never going to have good sex.
Yeah.
Even though we've not reached anything like that
And
point
Cary
yet.
Grant sits like this, watching it with delight.
And-
He
I know,
just
he-
watches them
Yeah,
grin.
no, that's his
Completely
best
after
scene in the
Dixie
film.
Belle's
Yeah.
Gone with the
Oh,
Wind
yes.
routine.
Yeah.
Irene Dunn doing afterwards, where she's
So-
very clearly very.
So I think when you
Really?
can't show sex, it forces you to be inventive, and I think that's one of the things about the screwballs is that they're forced to find new ways of representing this. The fast talking, all these different versions of intimacy that you have on show. It's because they can't show what maybe they would do. But then I was watching. This morning I started watching one of the rom-coms I kind of quite like, although I know it's terrible. A
Go
modern
on, confess it.
Which is Friends with Benefits,
Oh.
which is a Justin Timberlake, Mila Kunis film.
Yeah.
It's kind of, and I think it's very,
Oh, I'm watching that one.
I think it's a really interesting film because they're this couple who, so they get together, they're really good friends, and then they have this conversation on the sofa one night when she says, I'd really like to have sex, it's just like an itch, but I don't want all the emotional complications, so they decide they'll just have sex together, and that'll be fine. And then, of course,
There's
it all
some
becomes
very
more
looks in
complicated.
the audience.
To me, it's quite an interesting film because the more as you watch it, they each go back into their past, and you discover that the reason that they can't have a romance with each other thing is because they're really emotionally damaged. And it turns out it's actually a weird kind of film which is trying to be a screwball comedy, but actually it's about terrible people with terrible childhoods who just can't connect emotionally. And at some point somebody said, let's market it as a comedy if it's just in the middle of the but it's really, so Will Gluck, the writer-director, who I think must have had a very damaged childhood, he in interviews said that for him this relationship was very much like Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn in Adam's Rib. And I thought, whoa, that's a stretch. And then I was looking it up on IMDb, and IMDb, as you know, it does plot keywords. So I jotted down the plot keywords that it has for Friends with Benefits. They are female near nudity, oral sex, blowjob, girl in panties, no panties. No? And I think that confirms my impression that being able to show the stuff reduces the comic potential.
Yeah.
So
Well, that was good comic potential.
Go on,
I was
Kevin.
wondering, when you asked us what our favourite rom-com was, I was kind of scrolling back through my teenage years actually to think if there was one that I was particularly obsessed with. And actually, I wonder if the rom-com has found its true home in our current age on TV. And I was thinking about Friends as an obvious kind of ongoing kind of remarriage comedy in a sense, with your Ross and Rachel who were constantly breaking up and deferring that getting back together. And then things like New Girl and Moonlighting, and there's all sorts of TV series that kind of play with these tropes. And of course, they are working with TV broadcasting times, and so they also have to present sex in less explicit ways than panties, blowjobs, no panties. It's much more explicit than it was, but still they're working around it. And maybe Richard Curtis is not where we're going to find the ultimate new rom-com, but I think there's some really great TV writing that does fantastic things with dialogue.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. And I think that and Moonlighting is a really good example. And actually was one of the movies that turned me on to old movies as a kid, because it was, some of you none of you were old enough to remember it clearly, but you may know of it. It was Sybil Shepherd, and it was actually the show that gave Bruce Willis his start. And Sybil Shepherd and Bruce Willis, a couple of people who look like they were nodding, like I will look to her. Anyway,
He had like a smattering of hair.
yeah, exactly.
In
So
Moonlighting.
exactly, he had hair at
It's
that
quite
point. So
remarkable.
that was the show that. But anyway, the creator of it spoke at the time about the fact that it was based on old screwball comedies, and that was one of the ways that I, as a young person, discovered them. Anyway, so they were consciously modeling themselves on those films, as was Remington Steele, which gave Pierce Brosnan his start. And that gave, that also used to do shout outs to old movies. It would actually solve the plot where, because Remington Steele, the Pierce Brosnan character, was an old movie aficionado. And so he would say, this is just like Notorious, and which, you know, and then it would be Notorious. And I would like dutifully jot down, oh, Notorious, must go watch. Literally, that's an actually true story. And so, but what I think they get right, and that Screwball understood, and that with all due respect to Richard Curtis and his bazillions, he obviously knows something I don't, but that what they understood is that what makes a rom-com work, in my view, it's really, really simple, is that you have to understand that it's about the couple. People have to actually be invested in whether this couple gets together or not. It's a really actually simple thing. You have to care about the outcome. And one of the things I love about Screwball, and actually we haven't talked about the question of heterosexism in it, which I think is really, really important.
That's what I'd like to prompt you to talk about, actually, because we have been talking about a genre that privileges a heterosexual relationship. What happens to the romantic comedy when we talk about different kinds of relationships?
But this is exactly what I wanted to say, is that what the Screwball does is it presents the couple, this beautiful couple that we're talking about, this beautiful ideal couple, Cary Grant, Katharine Hepburn, right? But it presents them out of the drawing room comedy tradition as a couple almost like on a stage, right? You watch them on the screen together. It doesn't do the Hollywood shot reverse shot where it determines your identification. In other words, you're sitting there looking at two beautiful people and you can decide who you desire and who you identify with. So I actually think it's a very queer genre in terms of its energies, because the audience has, again, freedom to decide who it is that you're imagining you are in that couple.
I think you're slightly letting them off the leash there. But I wonder,
they're not, you know, you get Cary Grant in negligees and stuff. I mean, they're going to go as queer as they can.
Well, he does say it.
I've gone gay all of a
gone
sudden.
gay when he in that episode.
In bringing up
but what should we talk about this? What does the rom-com do in an age of different kinds of relationships and sexualities? Is it up to the task, or is it inherently a heterosexual, heteronormative genre?
Well, going back to Cavell, it's he drops a few kind of hints that maybe possibly it doesn't need to be, you know, this remarriage thing doesn't need to be heteronormative, but actually one of the kind of main ways in which the marriage works as an analogy is that the personal and the private, that kind of two I's becoming a we, and Cavell's very interested in kind of when can we use the first person plural, when do we become a we? So there's that private act, but also if you think about the end of the Philadelphia story in particular, in that final shot, we see the couple be placed into a newspaper, and that happens again and again and again in these films. There's a kind of gesturing towards newspapers, which makes it the social. And a marriage contract is a contract. It's legally binding, so it's a social, public recognition of that relationship. And so I wonder whether you can do anything, certainly within Cavellian terms about that analogy, until you get gay marriage being legalised. And I've been thinking about it in terms of, I watched Love, Simon the other day. I don't know how many people have
that's
seen
on Netflix,
that.
I think.
It's on Netflix at the moment, and it is one of the few kind of queer rom-coms or gay rom-coms that's out at the moment. And that's really fascinating, because it's all about a relationship that's formed precisely through communication, because he's emailing. The central character is emailing this anonymous another gay teenager at his school, but he doesn't know who it is, and the film is kind of constantly have you seen it? No. It's constantly testing out, is this person the pen pal, is this person the pen pal, is this person the pen pal? So it's the exact opposite actually of what you're saying, Sarah, which is that although there is a kind of gay couple, well, there is very much a gay couple, it's only in the very, very final shot that the two homosexual bodies are on screen together, and so there's on the one hand you get the deferring, but on the other hand it almost kind of differs too much.
Unravels.
You can't be invested in the couple because you don't know who the other half of the couple is. You're entirely invested in this one character.
Exactly. My feeling is something like Sleepless in Seattle to me, which so many people love, but for me it's this kind of anti-rom-com because they literally don't meet until the final frame. So I just am like, well, so the whole point is that it's about the couple against the world, and the movie is about making us care about that union. But as I say, I'm not letting them off the hook. I'm not saying that they were out to be, you know, obviously they weren't out to be progressive in that sense. It was a deeply heteronormative, heterosexist time. But there were an awful lot of queer people working on them, like George Cukor, for example. There were an awful lot of closeted people working on them, but also a lot of people who were out in Hollywood and were finding ways to get those energies in there and were making jokes about this. Lots of questions about Cary Grant and Randolph Scott, which, you know, we can't get into right now, but that's in My Favorite Wife. They bring in Randolph Scott, who was Cary Grant's roommate for many years, two of the most beautiful men in Hollywood living together for years. years.
Yeah.
There are a lot of people who are firmly of the opinion that they were having an affair. They always denied it. I'm not going to adjudicate that. The point is those energies are there and those scandals were there, but also that an awful lot of gay people also, as I say, love those movies
films.
and find the campiness in them, find the points of identification and desire, sit there and lust after, gay men lusting after Cary Grant just as much as I do. And so that's the point, is that it opens up those possibilities.
And those identifications.
Those freedoms, yeah.
Can I make a... Robert, you failed me in making a defence of the modern rom-com apart from
Sorry.
Friends with Benefits. But I want to
I will talk about some other.
Yeah, well, I want to try and prompt you to, because I know we're being pretty down on Richard Curtis, but I do think there is... Remember in Philadelphia Story, in Bring Up Baby, it is love at first sight, right? That's what happens to Catherine.
For her, not for him.
Yes.
But also, I mean, that is also the premise of For Weddings and a Funeral, love at first sight, again and again, the coup de foudre. And I wonder whether there is, something in the modern rom-com that captures something about that experience. Is the modern rom-com capable of capturing something about our modern experience of love?
I'm trying to think. I think the one actually for me that actually a couple. I mean, rather obviously, I think When Harry Met Sally. There are things wrong with it, but I really think it gets something about, and what it has in common with the screwball of the 30s is it's about intimacy.
Yeah,
It's about all the different ways that you can be intimate with someone, and so it's tacky in places, but it does bring a tear to my eye actually. Something.
Yeah.
But the other one I really like, I've watched a number of times, is the 40-Year-Old Virgin.
Oh, really?
And I think that is a film which is
Very
all
full of
about
surprises,
deferring
right?
sex, and you cannot have sex as part of film. It's got to
Yeah.
be pushed back and pushed back and pushed back, and he has to learn with enormous difficulty, the Steve Carell character, that sex actually isn't the point, that you've got to find a relationship and then you can have the sex. And it does end at the final frame is of them that they have just had thunderous sex, and she's lying back and cannot believe what's just happened. That's
But all the examples that you're giving and that I'm thinking of as well, actually, because I was thinking back to All the Boys I've Loved Before, which hopefully some people have seen.
The sequel is out today, guys, right? I'm keeping you from it.
Harry Met Sally. They're films where the couple is in place.
Yeah.
They're not necessarily a couple to start with, but they are old friends. Like they've had Harry Met Sally. They're friends for a really long time before they get together. Friends with benefits. Are friends before they become a couple. To All the Boys I Loved Before, it's the same thing. She's known him since she was a small child. And if you think about the television rom-coms where this happens as well, quite often they're friends. That there's sexual tension that builds and builds and builds over several series before the culmination, and it's one of those truisms that once the couple gets together in those TV series, then
it diffuses,
it diffuses everything. And so, to come back to the coup de foudre, actually, the coup de foudre seems to be what lets the rom-com down, that it doesn't work when there's not a slow build of that kind of simmering sexual tension.
But is it supposed to be a realist medium? I don't know if you go to the cinema to watch a rom-com because you're looking for something that reflects your actual relationships, or whether you want a fantasy which is made in Manhattan or something, or is it supposed to be a realist medium?
No, I mean, certainly, I hope not. I mean, I don't think it is. I certainly don't approach it that way. But I think that's again, is the question is what is one's pleasure, right? What is it that you find in that you find pleasurable? If you are somebody who loves Screwball, for instance, because of its verbal wit and facility, then Richard Curtis's fondness for montage is going to drive you up a wall, because he often can't be bothered to actually write the key scenes because he just has people walking and Elvis Costello singing, and that just kind of solves the problem. And that's fine if you like that sort of thing. But if you're in it for the verbal, verbal cleverness of it, then that's not going to be very satisfying. But also I think that it's the shift among all of these ensemble pairs that I think diffuses the energy, and I think that a lot of modern rom-coms fall back on that, and one of the reasons why the ones that we're mentioning, like When Harry Met Sally, in my view, work better, because they do give that energy and that devotion and the time to that couple, so that as an audience we care about the outcome, we're invested in it. And that's why I think for me, if we're going to go to Curtis, I don't personally enjoy watching Love Actually, because I just think it goes all over the place. Like, I can't figure out which couple I'm rooting for and who I care about, and it's 5 minutes on each. And so, but then I'm really angry about what that movie does to Laura Linney, because she doesn't even make it into the airport reunion scene. That movie loses all interest in poor Laura Linney. It just beats her up and then throws her out. I find it really, really objectionable. But I like Notting Hill. I think of all of them, I think Notting Hill is for me the most enjoyable personally. I don't think it's not a great movie, but I think it works best on its own terms because it actually is the most classic in its structure, and it lets us root for Hugh Grant and Julia Roberts.
About Time.
And About Time, absolutely, that does too.
Well, sorry, this is turned into an opinion fest, but I can't bear About Time. Don't at me, because why do the men only get to time travel? Why does he? So, but this is the other question I want to get to. Is it can we square the rom-com, screwball comedy, or the modern rom-com with a feminist ideal of womanhood, or is it one that is always going to require women to transform themselves, or somehow to seek the remedy of a handsome Hugh Grant at the end?
I'm okay with Laura Linney, but the bit that bothers me in Love Actually the most is Colin Firth falling in love with the woman who can't speak
his language,
and it's The Little Mermaid all over again. And I think maybe you saying maybe it's about what our tastes are. I suspect that the dorky person that became a film studies scholar and philosopher enjoyed the idea of these rom-coms where it was premised on not necessarily a coup de foudre that's love at first sight, but on witty dialogue and being intelligent. And another example that came to mind as I was thinking actually about kind of the Ralph Bellamy's of the world, and the bickering was Frozen, and the triangulation in Frozen of Prince Hans of the Southern Isle, who literally, he doesn't finish her sentences, he finishes her sandwiches, and the kind of the falseness of that idea of the coup de foudre, and the lovely relationship that develops between Anna and Christoph through friendship, and that's a very feminist film, and it decenters that romance, but at the same time it shows what a feminist romance can be. So I think those films are out there, and actually I think they might be coming from the teen genre and children's films more than they are from adults' films today.
I feel really strongly that screwball comedy is fundamentally and exactly in the ways that we've been saying, it is female-centered, and its energies are about loving and admiring strong, intelligent, forthright women. That's the whole energy of the movie. The man has to catch up with the woman, just as it's not about the woman transforming herself to be the little woman. That's actually when it starts to die, is in the early 40s, actually with the Tracy Hepburn movies like Woman of the Year, where she actually has to be put in her place. And that's why I think Philadelphia Story is problematic for that reason, because it is a taming of the Shrew story, where she has to admit that it was all her fault, which is not what most screwballs do. What most screwballs do is that they both have to acknowledge that they were at fault. And there are these wonderful lines where there's a one called It's a Wonderful World, which is Claudette Colbert and Jimmy Stewart. And he says to her, until I met you, I used to think that women stopped at the neck, but you sort of begin there. Right? There are all of these lines about them actually loving women for their minds and loving them because they are their equal partners. And It Happened One Night is entirely about that, right? Every time he lectures her, she shows him up, He teaches her how to hitchhike, and then she's like, well, I'll teach you how to hitchhike, baby.
Well, and that moment when she does pull the car over, and he's fulminating about it, and he says, why don't you just take all your clothes up, and you would have got 40 cars, and she says, I would have if I wanted 40 cars.
I'll remember that when we need 40 cars.
Exactly.
Bear in mind, the guy she stops then robs them.
Does rob them. So that's what it keeps moving, right? And that's why the Perelman line, I like that line about its energy is somewhere between a nosedive and a tailspin, right? It's got this propulsive energy where it just keeps, the screwy energy keeps pushing itself forward. But I don't think it is fundamentally a genre about putting women in their places. And these strong women actresses that we're talking about who are central to the form are never going to be put in their places.
What about the I think it seems a very unconvincing preconception, but the idea that rom-coms are for women, that they're a form of kind of films for chicks. Is there a sense that the modern rom-com is for everybody, and are there rom-coms that are deliberately aiming for a more diverse audience, or for?
It does seem to me that the modern things that I think of with rom-coms, I mean, things, terrible films like Maid of Honor and P.S. I Love You and stuff like that. These are aimed at women. They're fantasies about finding the right man, and The Holiday.
The Holiday, the worst film ever. I watched it at Christmas. I had to live tweet it. It was so terrible.
Yeah, so
Sorry.
I mean, they're fantasies about finding the right man, and to some extent about the inadequacies of most men, and but they don't. No, I don't think that they're films that are designed to appeal to. I mean, film, it seems to me, has become very divided nowadays. You know, it's either helicopters and car chases, or it's, you know.
But there are films like Knocked Up. And the new Seth Rogen one, which is on Netflix, and I've completely forgotten the
With Charlize Theron.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The Long Shot, thank
yeah.
you. That maybe, you know, we might call them gross-out comedies, or we might call them bromances, and Bridesmaids would be another one that kind of has rom-com elements, but doesn't necessarily pitch itself as a made-in-Manhattan-style romance.
Yeah.
So it, you know, the genre has fuzzy edges, and I think you know, those Seth Rogen kind of rom-coms, for want of a better way of putting it, do seem to set out to try and appeal to all sorts of different audiences. I'm not sure whether they manage it or not.
I mean, I find that the Seth Rogen stuff is enjoyable, but it is predicated on the fact that the men are all basically infantilized.
Yeah.
They all just want to smoke pot.
Yeah, exactly.
And the women
Look
are all
at boobs.
kind of
And the women are all really
and they're all very
uptight
uptight
and
and-
shrewish.
And it turns out that's all those women ever want. They want the
They want
stoner.
these schlubby stoner dudes. Exactly, and so that's what I mean is that in classic screwball, and the reason again why I would keep returning to it, and why I do often find contemporary rom-coms inadequate in those ways, is because it is because of those feminist energies where there is this sense of reciprocity. There's this sense of equality, of fight, and they're not that they've achieved equality, not that happens, not that they don't have all kinds of problematic patriarchal aspects, and obviously all of that stuff is in there. It's 1936 or whatever it is, for God's sake. But given that it's 1936, it's extraordinarily feminist, often more feminist than what we're seeing now. And it's this idealized version of these two fabulous people coming together because they deserve each other.
Yeah.
And neither one of them is settling. Neither one of them is like, oh, well, he'll do, or I just need any man. These are all women who are going to go through life single if they don't find Cary Grant. Now, that is a feminist message if ever there was one, as far as I'm concerned.
Let's get some questions in, because I feel like you guys are chomping at the bit. Especially anybody, I'd love to hear from anybody who wants to defend Love Actually in particular. So there's a question at the very back. Let's get the mic to you, and we'll get that question.
In my family, we kind of regard, this is a little bit out there, but Crazy Stupid Love to be almost like a modern, well, I guess Love Actually is as modern as it gets, but it kind of takes tropes.
Steve
Carell, like Emma
Ryan
Stone.
Gosling.
And I was wondering what you'd think of that, because I think that I would consider that to be one of, at least my favorite romantic comedies, if you say, but it definitely has a lot of the same like elements that Love Actually has. So just on that.
I mean, I personally love that movie. I agree with you. I think it's when Emma Stone says to him, "What are you photoshopped?" I laugh every single time. And I think precisely because of the ways in which it seems to be moving in those ensemble directions that move the energy away in the way that I think some of those Richard Curtis movies do. But it ends up, because of, I don't want to spoil it, it's well worth watching in my view, because of the way that those energies all come back together again. And so it's I agree with you. It's almost sort of what Curtis is trying to do at the end of Love Actually, but it's much more earned. And so there's a lot more, you have a lot more emotional sense of payoff at the way in which so basically the storylines converge in unexpected ways. And so you think you've got these separate couples, but actually the storylines come together. And so there is this sense in which the couples that you've been investing in all relate to each other in important ways, and it has a lot of wit, which I think is really important, and it plays with a lot of the motifs in it. The makeover motif, but instead of the woman being made over, it's Steve Carell, and so I think it's a really clever one.
Yeah.
I think it's a good example to bring in.
You mentioned Booksmart when we were talking before, the Beanie Feldstein and Caitlin Dever, which came out last year.
It's a great film, and I was also thinking about Being 17. I don't know if anyone's seen that. I mean, I really think that there are some kind of teen movies that are coming through now that are incredibly feminist. Booksmart is also very queer in its energies, and but it doesn't necessarily work in terms of the casting, because actually a lot of the time the teen films are using younger, much less well-known actors. Another film that came to mind was 10 Things I Hate About You, which is Julia Stiles and Heath Ledger, and they are stars, actually, even at that point in their careers. And the energy between them is phenomenal. And Emma Stone and Ryan Gosling, it struck me as another pairing that work in some of the same ways as those classic screwball pairings do. And of course La La Land isn't a rom-com, but also that repairing that
It would have
goes
been so
on.
much better if it were.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So the other one that often gets mentioned is the Silver Linings Playbook.
I was going to mention that.
With
Yeah.
Bradley Cooper and Jennifer Lawrence across several different films.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you want to come in, Robert, or should I take some more questions?
Well, sorry, I was just thinking with Silver Linings Playbook, that's absolutely the opposite of the screwballs in that they are not economically
No.
insulated from the world. That's one that really, you know,
Well, and they're
that's...
depressed.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what it's about, right?
Yeah.
It's really angry as a film.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it has that underlying sadness, which I think 10 Things I Hate About You has too. There's like an underlying sadness to Julia Stiles' character, and there is a way in which that version of the rom-com has something really honest about it, about sorrow in romance as well.
But I wonder how much of that is to do with them being younger as well,
Yeah.
and that the kind of angst of being a teenager,
Yeah.
and disenfranchised in a way that the characters in Silver Linings Playbook are disenfranchised because financially, the teenage characters are disenfranchised because of all sorts of different reasons to do with high school,
Yeah.
and she's lost her mother, I think, in that film as well.
Yeah.
And so it's a kind of flip side of the older characters that you get in the classic screwballs, who are in their late 20s and early 30s and are kind of over that period of their lives and are able to just enjoy adulthood and the luxuries that provides.
Yeah. There's a question at the front. Let's get that.
If there was no Hollywood, how would you define philosophy of love?
So if there was no Hollywood, how would you define the philosophy of love? So philosophy of love beyond Hollywood, and the question here.
Hi, thanks for coming. We've talked about the role of class and sexuality and how it's reflected in film and its implications on our social representations of these things. I was curious to know your ideas of race and representation, because a lot of the movies and actors we've mentioned, most of them have been white. And what does that mean? What should that mean?
Yeah, that's a great question. And then in the middle there.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm not going to defend Love Actually. I can't forgive it, actually. I don't think there's any film that's caused me more physical pain in the cinema than that. It's just wounding.
I've seen Sausage Party.
I can't ever see it ever again. But that's just me. I just wanted to ask you about Shakespeare, actually, because you did mention Shakespeare, and Taming the Shrew keeps getting referenced. But yeah, could you maybe explore that? I'm thinking particularly of Much Ado. Every time we talk about the...
Yeah, it's Beatrice and Benedict.
Yeah, exactly. Could you sort of maybe...
Okay, thank you. Any
develop that?
takers? So a philosophy of love beyond Hollywood, race in rom-com and Shakespeare. Any takers? Robert, do you want to have a go? You and I were talking about Shakespeare earlier.
Yeah, well, no, I was just going to say about race. I mean, I think Hollywood has come really late to the idea of that you can actually have racially diverse films that will make money. And Black Panther, which I think was a great film, has been extraordinary in the way it's changed the view and shown that actually you can have blockbusters with an African-American cast. But I mean, that doesn't mean there haven't been any films with a racial element. And the one that occurs to me, which I haven't seen for such a long time since it came out, is She's Gotta Have It, which is a really interesting feminist and racially interesting film with Spike Lee. Philosophy, Shakespeare. I mean, the one that Stanley Cavell doesn't talk about, although he talks a lot about remarriage as a theme in comedies, the one he doesn't talk about, which I think is interesting, is The Winter's Tale, which is the classic story of the couple who split over a misunderstanding, and then they don't see each other for 30 years, and when they do meet again, she's disguised as a statue, and he's thought she's dead all this time, and then, but then they do have this remarriage at the end, the realization of the mistake, and that you have to get over that and get back together. That's the classic structure of the screwball.
I mean, I would say two things. I'm not going to do the philosophy of love. I might leave that to the philosopher. But on the race question, I would add that, of course, when we're talking about the Hollywood films of the 1930s, we're talking about Jim Crow America. We're talking about a deeply segregated Hollywood. We're talking about Hattie McDaniel not being the first African American to win an Oscar in 1939. So it hasn't happened yet for most of the screwball period. And these are overwhelmingly white universes. They are it is a white cinematic universe. You get occasional racist stereotypes. You get the Japanese houseboy sometimes in them. You get various kinds of those kinds of racial, as I say, the stereotypes that were popular at the time.
Oh yes, in Breakfast and Tiffany's.
Well, that's late, and that's the Mickey Rooney thing is that's in the 60s.
Obscene. Isn't it?
It is obscene. but what I was going to say is that there are a couple of really interesting ones, not in Screwball, which is blindingly white, but one of the movies that I mentioned before, Babyface with Barbara Stanwyck, which is from 1931, and it's this movie was one of the ones where she sleeps her way to the top. She starts out as she's been prostituted by her father. So really, he runs a speakeasy, and it's very clear that he's been pimping her out since she was 14. She makes this absolutely explicit, and she runs away from him, and she runs away from him with her black best girlfriend. And at first you think she's her servant, and then it turns out that she's not her servant. And it's this road movie between this white woman, young, and they're girls, right? They're teenagers in the story. And it's actually one of the most extraordinary early roles. And I actually blanked on her name, which is stupid of me, but she was an amazing actress. And she went on to do a series of really interesting roles where she managed to kind of push her way through to a certain extent. But then, of course, the Hollywood racial ceiling, clamped right back down on her. So there are a couple of interesting moments in this period, but not anywhere near enough. In terms of Shakespeare, it is Beatrice and Benedick, and From Much Ado About Nothing, and that's something that Cavell talks a lot about. That is something that gets referenced a fair amount. The directors were consciously working on that, but also, as I said, on Noel Coward. So Noel Coward is repurposing. And again, speaking of queer energies too, right? So that kind of design for living model of how can we update Beatrice and Benedick, and how can we play through it? And then they take that kind of modernization of it via the British drawing room comedy and take it into Hollywood. So there's a pretty clear genealogy there, and they're consciously referencing it.
Catherine, you want to have a go?
I'm going to try and keep my comments relatively brief. So starting with race, I think it's shifting massively, actually. Those films that I was just mentioning, so obviously To All the Boys I've Loved Before and Being 17, both have East Asian characters as central roles in a way that's not necessarily...
We haven't mentioned Crazy Rich Asians, the best rom-com in ages. How have we not mentioned that?
Yeah. It's not necessarily a facet. They're not kind of comedies about race. They just happen to have a diversity of characters in them. So
The Big Sick, I was thinking of.
I thought that was good.
And going back to kind of sort of classic era Hollywood, it's not a screwball, but one of the films that Cavell writes about in a really complicated and not necessarily always successful way is The Bandwagon, where there's a scene where Fred Astaire goes into this kind of arcade and gets a shoe shine by a black shoe shine boy who's played by Lee Daniels, and they start dancing together, and it's this really strange sort of moment where Cavell defends it as a kind of dance of praise, where he's acknowledging the efforts of black dancers who have taught Fred Astaire all that he knows, and other critics, such as Michael Rogan, see it as kind of appropriation. And then there are other critics still that read it as a queer scene where you have these two men dancing together. So I think there are things there that kind of fall between the cracks that need sort of mining out. But it does seem to be shifting. In terms of Shakespeare, Cavell writes at great length about all of the correspondences that he sees between kind of the classic comedies and the screwball comedies, and in fact he does pick up The Winter's Tale at various points, and he writes a long comparison of the Shakespeare's Winter's Tale and Romer's Winter's Tale in one of the essays that's in which is worth having a look at. And in terms of the philosophy of love, I feel like that's probably a whole other forum. But what I would recommend if you're interested in it is I've just read a book by the philosopher Luke Ferry, which is called On Love. And he talks about us now being in the era of love. So we're no longer interested in kind of religion or in humanism or in the state or in nation, but in love. And I guess it leads on to questions of things like reproductive futurism and what is it that we're leaving to our children and where does that take us? So I think when we've talked about love so far in a very unproblematic way, isn't it lovely? Don't we all want to be in love? But love can be co-opted for all sorts of different purposes as well. So yes, there's an open hole, but I can't recommend that book highly enough. Luke Ferry's On Love. It's really great.
Thank you. Let's get another round of three if we can. So one at the very back there, one in the middle, and one along.
Hello, thank you very much for your talks. Lots of interesting things to think about, and I've got a whole list of films I've not heard about, and I'm going to go and watch tonight. Well, not tonight, that'll be a long night.
Not Sausage Factory.
I was just wondering, to hear your thoughts on, I think we all watch rom-coms when we're growing up as teenagers, with our friends or alone, and I think you learn a lot about relationships and love through them. You learn about love through your parents and through, your friends, your village, essentially. But yeah, what you see in films can be particularly formative. So I'm just wondering how you feel about rom-coms as love lessons and how they set the bar for society and give us standards and perhaps teach us moral codes and what's right and wrong and how we learn from the characters' mistakes. Yeah, just be good to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Question, do you want to take over my job? There was one in the middle and then the one at the end.
Thank you. I think my connection connects a bit to yours. It's about, I think, the relationship between love and individuality, and maybe how rom-coms can, by equating happiness with like a monogamous relationship, it takes away from personal growth. Do you think that might be an issue? And kind of the other issue potentially with rom-coms, it's this profit motive, that it has become very formulaic and it kind of kills off the creativity. Do you see those two as being issues to the genre of rom-coms?
Great, good question too. And then at the very end?
I wanted to get your opinion on films like 500 Days of Summer or High Fidelity, which kind of present more questions about love and breakups along with it.
Is that the indie rom-com? Indie?
Yeah, I guess so.
Maybe? No? Yeah, any takers? Rom-mopes, did you say? Robert, you seem like you were intrigued by the second question.
Which was that about how does love detract from personal growth?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that sort of goes with the first one
Yeah.
about what we learn from rom-coms. I mean, I think I'd say I grew up watching these comedies when they used to be on television on a Saturday afternoon. So I watched Philadelphia Story and Bringing Up Baby when I was far too young to understand that sex was even an issue in them. And what I took from them then, I don't really know. What I take from them now is that I think that the best rom-coms teach you about understanding yourself and understanding your needs. And I think that's what you really see happening in The Lady Eve and The Awful Truth. They're about people who don't understand themselves. And they fall out of love with someone because they don't realise they need the other person. They feel they're in some way self-sufficient. And what they have to learn through the course of the film is that they do need the other person. Now that's how that plays into your question about whether it detracts from personal growth. I don't know. It's a very difficult thing. I mean, actually, I'd rather... In a way, I find it easier to talk about my own experience. I got divorced a few years ago. And I thought at that point I would be desperately unhappy by myself. And I spent several years living on my own with the family dog. And I actually find now it's really hard to contemplate the idea of living with someone else. Yeah. And I don't know if that counts as personal growth or if that's actually a personal shrinkage. So I don't see why personal growth and another person, individual growth, why they have to be opposed to each other. Sure, you can grow individually with another person, and maybe that can be a catalyst for growth in ways that you couldn't imagine by yourself. And I think maybe that's the lesson of the rom-com, that other people teach you to imagine more.
Yeah. I mean, I think for me, we can see them as movies about monogamy, and on some level, certainly they are, right? Although there's a lot of cheating that goes on in them, right? So they're always about testing out other partners. They're separated. There's always a competition and a rival in there, and they're often they do marry other people and then get divorced from those people and remarry them. So there is sex that is happening kind of off screen sometimes as well. So in My Favorite Wife, for example, he thinks that Cary Grant thinks that Irene Dunn is dead. She's been gone for 7 years, and a lot of the comedy is about the fact that he really wants to get laid, and so he's going to marry somebody else. So there are very definite sexual rivals that are in there. So it's not. I don't think it's really at all a mode that is kind of puritanically, in the American sense, kind of pushing you toward monogamy. I don't think it's actually a very conservative mode in that sense at all. But I do think it's about partnership. It's this exaltation of partnership. And this idea of, and it goes back to Catherine's point about the changing ideas about marriage and divorce at the time, which are really important, about women getting rights at the time. Women get the vote in 1920 in America, so almost exactly the same time as here. And then they get sexual independence and economic independence come along with that. They move to cities. They're living these lives. In a lot of these movies, these women don't seem to have a family. They don't seem to have a past. They just kind of emerge into the urban scene, and they're just kind of there finding their way around, right? So their individuality is not being compromised. It's that they're seeking this kind of collaboration in life that's going to make life better and easier. So this model of companionate marriage, which, yes, sex is a part of, but it's also about this idea of, as I say, of kind of finding your equal. And then having this battle out because they're two powerful people figuring out what that equality looks like. So for me, that's really the answer to the first question as well, which is that the reason that I was so attached to these movies is because for me, they were modeling. I was growing up in the 80s when it was literally the age of Fatal Attraction, when a powerful woman was a psychopath who needed to be shot in the bathtub by the good little wife at home, right? And those were the women who were on screen. And so it was like, then I discovered these women where it's Katharine Hepburn and Barbara Stanwyck holding their own and looking fabulous while they do it, I might add. Talking a mile a minute, being absolutely brilliant. And then these men who come to them and admire them for who they are. So for me, it was an ideal and a fantasy. Of course it was, but it was helping me imagine that kind of ethical equality and collaborative companionate relationship. And as I say, that to me is also why, although one could root your way through it toward monogamy or toward heteronormativity, but also I think that what it's actually just talking about is kind of human appreciation and partnership on some level, and that message opens itself up in the ways that we've been talking about.
Catherine?
I don't want to close things on a much more negative note. I actually am very aware of the persistence of the couple, and maybe this is coming back to that question about forms of love as well. I have a 6-year-old daughter who is currently going through the very early stages of rom-coms in things like Frozen and High School Musical. And every time that the couple get together at the end, she literally kind of moans with pleasure because this is the culmination of all the fairy stories that she reads, and it's still the culmination of so many children's films and teenage films, and even if you switch out the heterosexual couple for a homosexual couple within Cavellian philosophy of love, you're still talking about a couple. So there's not really any room here for kind of more plural forms of love. But one of the things that possibly I can find as a sort of slightly positive outlook is that there are in films like Bridesmaids and Booksmart and Lady Bird and Frozen, there does seem to be a shift away from romantic love as being always the end game, and a move towards different kinds of love, whether that's companionship or friendship or maternal love or sibling love. And actually even Love, Simon, which was the film I was just talking about, although it does kind of close off with this getting together of the couple, in some ways it's a lot more about the friendship that he has with 3 other teenagers that kind of see him through this journey. So I completely agree with you that films, amongst other art forms, teach us how to love. And I think I spent most of my teenage years trying to argue with my male friends because all of the films that I saw said that you're going to fall in love with your best friend if only you argued with them enough. Did it work? Things a lot about my marriage. But I think that model might be shifting. I hope that model is shifting, and that other forms of love, not that screwball love isn't wonderful, but there are also kind of other bonds that are dogs and leopards.
As we were talking, Marley and me for you, Robert, I think. As you were talking, Catherine, I was thinking about who is the greatest couple, rom-com couple. I was thinking, I'm pretty sure it's Bill and Ted. And there is a Bill and Ted 3 coming out, which is basically going to be